When a loyal maid was denied the chance to attend her father's funeral, she made a choice that shattered years of silence and exposed the cruel secrets of a powerful family. Her courage sparked a movement no one saw coming. This is a story of grief, dignity, and the unstoppable strength of finding your voice. Where are you watching from today? Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, unforgettable stories like this. The morning always came before the world was ready. In that deep hush before dawn, I would wake without an alarm, my body knowing the hour better than any clock. I'd sit up slowly on my cot in the tiny room tucked away in the servants' wing of the Dalton estate. My joints ached with a dull familiarity, but I paid them no mind. This was just the rhythm of my life, steady, unchanging, silent. The chill in the room greeted me like an old friend as I pulled on my uniform. Plain black slacks, a starched white blouse, and the soft gray apron tied neatly at my waist. I paused for a moment to smooth the wrinkles with my palms, pressing down harder than necessary, as if I could iron out the years, the weariness, the growing emptiness inside me. But some creases don't lift, no matter how hard you try. The house itself still slept as I slipped into the kitchen. The marble floors, so cold they seemed to hum, stretched out before me. Above, the grand chandelier, imported from Italy, as Mrs. Dalton often boasted, hung lifeless in the half-light, scattering fractured reflections across the polished countertops. I moved through the space like a ghost, knowing every creak of the floorboards, every temperamental faucet handle, every shadow. I brewed the French press coffee with a precision that had become muscle memory over 12 years. I reheated the scones we had prepared the night before, careful not to let the butter burn. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon oil and old, tired starch. My hands worked quickly but methodically, setting out the antique porcelain cups and folded linen napkins on a silver tray. There was a sacredness to these rituals, even if no one noticed them but me. 12 years. 12 years of rising before the sun to serve a family that barely remembered my name. To the Daltons, I was not Maria. I was the maid, the help. Dear, if they were feeling generous. Girl, if they were not. I had once dreamed that if I worked hard enough, smiled politely enough, there might be a nod of appreciation, a sincere thank you. But in my mid-40s now, with a back that stiffened every time I bent too long over the Carrara marble floors, I no longer entertained such foolish hopes. I moved through the great house smoothing pillows, straightening paintings, preparing for the Daltons to awaken and resume their reign over their silent kingdom. Every surface gleamed because of me. Every rug lay perfect because of me. Yet I remained unseen, like the thin layer of polish that made the silver shine, but was invisible to the eye. I was fluffing the last cushion in the sitting room when I heard the soft tap-tap of Mrs. Dalton's slippers on the stairs. I turned just in time to see her descend like royalty, a powder blue silk robe trailing behind her, her platinum hair coiffed so tightly it looked like porcelain. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she entered the dining room. Without a word, she glanced at the coffee tray, inspecting it as if any error might warrant public execution. Warm, not hot, she said sharply, inspecting the cup like a jeweler studying a flawed diamond. Yes, ma'am, I murmured, adjusting the pour until she was satisfied. My voice was soft, neutral, polished by years of practice. I might as well have been part of the furniture for all the notice she gave me. A few minutes later, her daughters, Victoria and Natalie, floated into the room in matching designer loungewear, their hair glossed to perfection, their phones glued to their manicured hands. They barely spared me a glance as they collapsed into their seats, filling the air with a sickly sweet perfume and laughter that felt just a little too sharp. Did you see what Miranda wore to the gala last night? Victoria giggled, tapping away at her phone. It looked like something the help would wear. Natalie snorted. Probably got it from a clearance bin. Tragic. Neither of them even glanced at me as they threw their little darts, as casual and thoughtless as tossing breadcrumbs to pigeons. I felt the words slice into me, but I showed nothing. I had long since mastered the art of absorbing insults like dust into a broom, sweeping them away with the morning chores. I stood against the wall, perfectly still, perfectly silent, as the women discussed weekend plans and gossiped about friends and foes alike. Occasionally, Mrs. Dalton would snap her fingers without looking up, A silent order for more jam, a less burned slice of toast, a napkin folded a different way. I moved swiftly, invisibly, meeting their needs before they had to speak them aloud. The day stretched on in its slow, punishing rhythm. After breakfast, there was the polishing of the silver, then airing out the linen closets, then prepping the guest rooms, even though no guests were scheduled. At noon sharp, I served lunch on the back patio, where the girls lounged like queens on vacation, tossing their sunglasses from hand to hand and laughing at jokes I was never meant to hear. By late afternoon, my legs burned and my back throbbed, but there were still cocktails to be served in the parlor. Mr. Dalton sat by the fireplace, his long legs crossed, scanning the stock reports with an air of bored superiority. He didn't look up when I entered. "Put it there," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the side table. "Yes, sir," I replied, setting the tray down so carefully it barely made a sound. He didn't thank me. He never did. Dinner was a formal affair, despite there being no guests. The dining table stretched the entire length of the room, gleaming under a crystal chandelier that had taken me 4 hours to clean last spring. I served course after course in silence, responding only to snapped fingers and curt nods. When Natalie leaned over to whisper loudly to Victoria, "Imagine doing this every day. Must be the saddest life," I clenched my hand so tightly around the tray that my knuckles went white. Still, I smiled. Still, I bowed my head. Still, I played the role they expected. Quiet, dutiful, invisible. Later, after the last dish was cleared, after the crystal glasses were dried and returned to their velvet-lined shelves, I slipped back into my room. I pulled off my shoes with a groan, feeling my feet throb and swell in protest. In the dim light from the single bare bulb overhead, I opened the drawer of my nightstand and took out the only treasure I kept in this house. A worn, cracked photograph of my father, holding a much younger me in his arms. His smile in that picture was pure, unguarded, filled with a pride I had tried so hard not to disappoint. I touched the photograph gently, running my thumb along the faded edges. "I'm still trying, Papa," I whispered into the empty room. But deep inside, a truth I didn't want to face was beginning to stir. Maybe trying wasn't enough anymore. Maybe being invisible wasn't survival. It was surrender. The house settled around me with its usual hush of distant laughter and clinking glasses, sounds I wasn't part of, wasn't meant to be part of. I curled up on my narrow cot, the photograph still pressed against my heart, and closed my eyes against the familiar ache of another day spent unseen. I didn't know then that everything was about to change, that in just a few hours, a single phone call would crack my world wide open and leave nothing standing. The vibration against my hip felt like a wasp trapped under my apron. I froze for a second, the silver tray in my hands tipping ever so slightly, almost betraying me. No one called me, not during hours, not ever. It was an unspoken rule here. The help had no life beyond the polished walls of the Dalton estate. I balanced the tray on the sideboard and slipped my hand into the deep pocket of my apron, fingers closing around the cool plastic of my old, battered phone. The screen blinked urgently. One message from Lucy. My heart thudded once, painfully hard. My sister knew better than anyone not to contact me unless it was important. Life or death important. With a glance over my shoulder to make sure no one was watching, I tucked the tray neatly onto the linen runner and slipped out of the dining room, my steps soft, practiced. I ducked into the butler's pantry, the one place in this entire house where the Daltons rarely ventured, and pulled the door almost closed behind me. I opened the message with trembling fingers. "Call me now. It's Papa." The air whooshed out of my lungs as if someone had punched me. For a moment, I just stared at the words, hoping if I looked long enough, they would rearrange themselves into something else, something harmless. They didn't. My thumb slipped twice before I managed to press the call button. The ringing in my ear was deafening, louder than the low hum of the refrigerator, louder than the crackle of the old intercom system in the wall. 1 ring. 2. Lucy answered in a whisper so fragile it barely made it across the line. "He's gone, Maria." I didn't understand at first. The words floated there, suspended in the stale, lemon-scented air of the pantry, disconnected from meaning. Gone where? Gone to the hospital? Gone back home? My mouth opened, but no sound came out. She repeated it, barely a breath. "Papa's gone. Last night, his heart, He didn't make it. The floor tilted under my feet. I reached blindly for the counter to steady myself. My father, my steady, smiling father who could fix anything with a hammer and a bit of wire, who used to lift me onto his shoulders and march through the town square, laughing like a man who had everything, even when we had nothing. The man who had saved every spare penny to send me to school, who had told me I was meant for more than scrubbing someone else's floors. Gone. A broken sound tore from my throat, too raw to be a sob, too real to hold back. My knees buckled and I slid down against the cabinet until I sat on the cold tile floor, my back pressed to the wall, my phone slipping from my fingers into my lap. I must have stayed there for minutes or hours. Time collapsed into itself. I don't remember. Eventually I became aware of the world again. The sharp sting of tile against my legs. The weight of the day pressing forward, whether I was ready or not. The Daltons' lives, their plans, their grand events, all humming on upstairs as if nothing had changed. I wiped my face with my apron, shoved my phone back into my pocket, and forced myself to stand. The world didn't care about my broken heart. Breakfast still needed clearing. The silver still needed polishing. I stumbled back into the dining room carrying a fresh carafe of coffee. Mrs. Dalton glanced up briefly, her lips pursing at the sight of me. "More jam," she said curtly, not noticing the redness around my eyes or the way my hands trembled. Victoria and Natalie were laughing over something on their phones, their voices shrill and bright, filling the room like a foghorn. They didn't notice anything either. No one did. By mid-morning, I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't go on folding napkins and polishing glasses as if the center of my world hadn't just been ripped away. I asked the house manager for a word and was sent, like a schoolgirl summoned before the headmistress, to the East Wing, where Mrs. Dalton spent her mornings in her private sitting room. The door was ajar, the scent of expensive face cream and powder drifting out. I knocked softly, heart hammering in my chest. "Yes?" She called, not looking up from her vanity mirror, where she was carefully applying a second layer of lipstick. I stepped inside, my voice catching before I could force it into something steady. "Ma'am, I just received a call. My father passed away last night. I need a few days to go home for the funeral." There was a pause, barely the length of a heartbeat, but I felt it stretch and snap inside me like a rubber band pulled too tight. "Mrs. Dalton set down her lipstick tube and turned in her chair to face me, her blue eyes cool, assessing. "Maria, you know we have the benefit gala this weekend. The house must be flawless. We can't afford to fall behind." I blinked, not understanding at first. "Yes, ma'am, but it's just 4 days. I'd be back before the event, I promise." She sighed, as if I were a disobedient child testing her patience. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "But this isn't a convenient time. If you insist on leaving, you'll forfeit your end-of-year bonus." I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could form the words, Mr. Dalton entered the room, adjusting his cufflinks with that air of practiced nonchalance he always wore. "What's this?" he asked mildly. "Maria wants to leave," Mrs. Dalton said without looking at him. "Her father passed." He frowned, a slight crease forming between his brows. "Unfortunate timing. We need all hands on deck this week. We can offer double the bonus if she stays." Double the bonus. As if money could plug the hole that had just torn open in my chest. I stared at them. Two people who had built their lives on polished stone and polished lies, and realized with an almost physical jolt that they didn't see me. Not really. I wasn't Maria James to them. I wasn't a daughter who had just lost the man who had taught her how to ride a bike and hammer a nail and believe in herself. I was a convenience, a machine, a cog in their well-oiled luxury. I swallowed a lump in my throat, struggling to find words that wouldn't sound like begging. "Please," I said, the words scraping raw against my tongue. "It's just a few days. It's my father." Mr. Dalton gave a little shrug, adjusting his jacket. "Surely your family will understand. We all have responsibilities." It was the casualness of it that shattered me. The way they weren't cruel, exactly. Cruelty requires acknowledgement. They were indifferent. As if my grief, my father, my entire world was a minor scheduling inconvenience. I stood there, frozen between rage and despair, until I realized the silence had stretched too long. I mumbled something, I don't even remember what, and backed out of the room, retreating down the long, gleaming hallway that I had once polished to a perfect mirror shine. I made it to my little room before the tears came, hot and blinding, unstoppable. I sat on the edge of my cot, the photograph of my father clutched against my chest, and sobbed silently into my apron. They had told me, without words, that my father's life, his death, my grief, meant nothing compared to the clink of crystal glasses and the shine of marble floors. And for the first time in 12 years, I realized something deep and unmovable inside me had snapped. I wasn't going to stay. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to be invisible anymore. I barely slept that night. I lay on the narrow cot, staring at the cracked ceiling, my father's photo pressed to my chest like a shield against the grief gnawing at my insides. The silence around me, once so heavy and familiar, felt unbearable now, like the walls themselves were complicit in my sorrow. Every tick of the old clock on the nightstand was a hammer against my ribs. By morning, my mind was made up. I had rehearsed the words over and over in my head. Polite but firm, respectful but unmovable. I would not beg. I would ask one more time, not because I expected them to suddenly find compassion, but because I needed to know that I had tried, that I had given them the chance to be decent, even if they didn't deserve it. I dressed carefully, smoothing the wrinkles from my blouse with hands that trembled slightly. The house was just beginning to stir. The distant clatter of the gardener unloading his tools. The low rumble of the chef's van pulling into the service entrance. Upstairs, faint footsteps creaked across the polished oak floors as Mrs. Dalton began her morning routine. I waited until after breakfast was served. Not because I cared about their convenience anymore, but because I knew better than to interrupt the sacred ritual of their first coffee. When the table was cleared and the dishes stacked in the kitchen sink, I wiped my hands on my apron, squared my shoulders, and made my way once again to the east wing. The sitting room door was open. Mrs. Dalton sat before the vanity, brushing a pale pink powder across her already flawless skin. Her robe was a deep emerald green today, matching the stones in her earrings. She caught my reflection in the mirror and gave a single, impatient glance. "Yes?" she said without turning fully toward me. I stepped inside, forcing the words through the tightness in my throat. "Mrs. Dalton, I need to ask again. I know the gala is important, but I just need a few days, just 4. I'll work double shifts when I return if necessary." She set down her brush with a soft clink. "Maria," she said, in that tone she reserved for reprimanding children or staff who disappointed her, "we discussed this yesterday." I took a small step closer, my voice gentler than I felt. "I understand, truly I do, but this is my father's funeral, I can't miss it, please." For the first time, she fully turned to face me. Her eyes, so sharp and pale they looked almost colorless in the morning light, studied me with a cool detachment that made my skin prickle. "If you leave now," she said, enunciating every word like a judge handing down a sentence, "you will forfeit your bonus. You will forfeit your future references, and you may not find a place here when you return." The blow landed harder than I expected. Not because I was surprised, I wasn't. But because somewhere, deep down, a foolish sliver of me had still hoped for something better. That maybe, just maybe, they would see me. Just once. I opened my mouth, desperate to find the words that might crack the armor around her, when Mr. Dalton appeared in the doorway, fastening his expensive watch onto his wrist. "What's going on?" he asked, glancing between us. "Maria still wants to leave for her father's funeral," Mrs. Dalton said without a hint of emotion. He clicked his tongue softly, as if the whole situation were a minor inconvenience, like a forgotten grocery item. "Maria," he said, using my name like it was a favor, "we are willing to increase your bonus even more. Triple it if you stay. Think about it. That kind of money isn't easy to come by for people like you." People like you. The words hit harder than any slap. People like you. As if I were a different species, as if grief and dignity and love for family were luxuries I had no right to claim. I felt my hands clench at my sides, nails biting into my palms, but I forced myself to stay steady. My voice, when it came, was low and even. "Money won't bring my father back," I said, "and it won't buy my silence anymore." Mr. Dalton frowned, clearly irritated. "Maria, this is business. It's not personal. Everyone sacrifices in their career. That's how the world works." The audacity of it. The absolute certainty that their world, their priorities, should naturally eclipse mine, left me momentarily speechless. They weren't cruel. They weren't even angry. They were simply indifferent. And somehow that was worse. I could have yelled, I could have wept, I could have thrown the delicate crystal vase from the vanity against the wall just to hear it shatter. But I didn't. Instead, I straightened my spine, feeling taller than I had in years, and said the only words that mattered, "I'm going." Mrs. Dalton's lips thinned. "Then you understand the consequences." "I understand," I said. Neither of them moved to stop me as I turned and walked out of the room. Neither of them called after me. I might have been a broken lamp or a misplaced rug, an inconvenience they would deal with later. In the kitchen, I finished the day's work. I served lunch. I polished the silverware one last time. I smiled when instructed to, bowed when required. But inside, I was already gone. When the dinner bell rang that evening, I was there with the tray. When Mr. Dalton asked for his scotch, I poured it with a hand so steady it surprised even me. I moved through the gleaming halls of that mansion one final time, and not once did they notice the shift in me, the fact that I was no longer theirs to command. Later that night, long after the last light in the house had been extinguished, I sat on the edge of my cot and packed my few possessions into an old, battered suitcase. 2 changes of clothes, a worn Bible, a frayed scarf my father had given me when I first left home. And the photograph. Always the photograph. I folded my apron carefully and placed it on top of the suitcase. Outside, the night was deep and still. The kind of silence that feels heavy, almost sacred. I pressed my forehead to the cold window pane, staring out at the manicured hedges and stone fountains, the empty drive where luxury cars had once idled, waiting for laughter-filled parties that I would never be part of. Tomorrow, before the sun rose, I would walk away from this life. Not because I had been driven out. No, because I chose to leave. And somehow, despite the ache in my heart, despite the uncertainty that loomed like a storm cloud beyond the gates, I felt stronger than I had in years. It was time. Time to go home. Time to reclaim the parts of myself I had allowed to be buried under polish and obedience. Time to be Maria James again, daughter, sister, woman, not just the help. The wind picked up outside, rattling the old window frame. Somewhere deep inside me, something rattled loose too, a final chain snapping. I closed my eyes, clutched the photograph to my chest, and whispered into the darkness, "I'm coming, Papa." And this time, nothing would stop me. The sky was still ink black when I rose from the cot, moving by memory in the dark. My suitcase sat by the door, packed and waiting like a promise. I stood for a moment, letting the stillness of the house settle around me, memorizing the small room that had never really been mine. It smelled faintly of lemon polish and old fabric, the air heavy with the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken mornings. There were no pictures on the walls, no mementos except the photograph I carried against my chest. No trace that I had ever truly lived here. I reached out and touched the doorknob, my hand trembling just once before I steeled myself. Beyond that door, the house sprawled in silent luxury. Grand chandeliers, imported marble, thick carpets that muffled every sound except the soft, stubborn thud of my heart. I stepped into the corridor, my footsteps whispering against the polished floor. The chandeliers above me hung unlit, their crystals catching the faintest shimmer of the approaching dawn. The portraits of Dalton ancestors watched from their gilded frames with blank, judgmental eyes. I moved past them without a second glance. Down the main hallway, through the kitchen, everything so familiar it almost hurt. I paused just once at the old wooden schedule clipboard that hung on the wall beside the pantry door. Every hour of every day, mapped out in neat ink. Polish, serve, clean, disappear. I slipped a folded note beneath it, the handwriting steady, though my hands shook. "Thank you for the opportunity. I will not be returning. Respectfully, Maria James." It wasn't anger that filled me as I left it there. It wasn't even sadness. It was a kind of quiet finality, like placing the last stone on a grave. I moved toward the back door, the one the staff used, the one that never squeaked because we kept it greased and silent, like everything else we were expected to be. I reached for the handle and froze, leaving without saying goodbye. The voice, low and unmistakably smooth, cut through the stillness. I turned slowly to see Mr. Dalton standing in the kitchen doorway, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hair still damp from a shower. His face, always so composed, now looked almost curious, as if he couldn't quite piece together why the machinery was walking off without permission. I straightened my spine. "Yes," I said simply. He stepped closer, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "That's a shame," he mused. "I thought we had an understanding." "We don't," I said, my voice steady in a way it had never been before. He sighed as if this whole thing were terribly inconvenient. "You're overreacting, Maria. I know you're upset and I'm sorry for your loss, but this isn't how the world works. You work, you get paid. Loyalty matters. People who show loyalty are rewarded. Others," he shrugged, "others are replaceable." I felt the heat rising up my throat, but it wasn't fear. It wasn't grief. It was something fiercer, purer. The slow, burning anger of someone who has finally realized she deserves more. "I gave you 12 years, I said, my voice low but unshakable. 12 years of my hands, my feet, my silence. I cooked your meals. I raised your children when you were too busy. I ironed your sheets, polished your crystal, bowed my head and swallowed my pride. I missed birthdays, funerals, my niece's graduation. And when my father—" My voice cracked for a moment, but I forced it back. "When my father died, you asked me to pretend it didn't matter." He opened his mouth, but I raised a hand and kept going. "I'm not asking you for anything anymore," I said. "I'm leaving. You don't have to understand. You don't even have to agree. You just have to get out of my way." For a long, waited second, neither of us moved. The silence stretched between us, thick and electric. Then, finally, he stepped aside, a faint smirk playing at the corner of his mouth, the same smirk he wore when negotiating business deals he thought he'd already won. "Suit yourself," he said. "You'll regret this. Out there, no one's lining up to hire people like you. You had a good deal here. Comfort, security, you'll see." I looked at him then, really looked. Not the tailored suit, not the polished shoes, not the power he wore like a second skin. I saw a small, tired man who had built his entire world on the backs of people he never once truly saw. A man who confused obedience with loyalty, silence with satisfaction. I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. I turned, opened the door, and stepped out into the breaking dawn. The cold air hit me like a blessing, sharp and alive. The street was quiet, still cloaked in that blue-gray hush that belongs only to the earliest hours of morning. The taxi I had arranged waited by the curb, the driver leaning against the hood, hands in his pockets, hat pulled low against the chill. As I rolled my suitcase down the driveway, I felt the security camera perched above the gate whir and swivel to follow my exit. I wondered if Mrs. Dalton was awake yet, reading my note with those tight, pursed lips, wondering how the help could be so ungrateful. I didn't care. The driver tipped his cap without speaking and helped me load the suitcase into the trunk. I slid into the back seat, the cracked leather sticking to my palms. Only when the door shut, with a soft, final thunk, did I allow myself to exhale. The car pulled away, the Dalton estate shrinking in the rear-view mirror with every turn of the wheels. I didn't look back. The sun was just beginning to climb over the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of gold and violet. The city yawned awake around us. Bakeries lifting their shutters, newspaper vendors setting up stands, a stray dog trotting purposefully down the sidewalk. Ordinary life, beautiful in its lack of pretense. At the station, I boarded the early train heading south. The platform smelled of diesel and old wood, a scent that pulled at something deep in my memory. A younger version of myself boarding a train to the city all those years ago, full of hope and fear and ambition. Now, I was boarding another train, but this time I wasn't running towards someone else's dream. I found a seat by the window and settled in, my suitcase tucked close by, the photograph of my father resting in my lap. As the train lurched forward and the cityscape blurred into open fields, I watched the world rush by and felt something I hadn't felt in a very, very long time. Lightness. It wasn't joy. Not yet. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter. Freedom, maybe. Or just the absence of fear. I closed my eyes and whispered into the whir of the train wheels, almost too softly for even myself to hear. "I'm coming home." And for the first time in years, the words didn't feel like a wish. They felt like a promise. The town came into view just as the first real light of morning stretched over the hills, soft and golden, painting everything it touched with a gentle kind of mercy. The train slowed with a long, mournful screech, and I felt my heart drum harder against my ribs. I pressed my forehead lightly against the cool glass of the window, taking in the sight of my hometown, small, stubborn, and beautiful in its own weathered way. The station was nothing more than a single cracked platform surrounded by dusty roads and patches of overgrown grass. No marble floors here, no chandeliers, just earth and wood and history. I stepped down from the train, the weight of my suitcase dragging on one arm, and the heavier, invisible weight of grief pressing into my chest. Lucy was already there, standing at the far end of the platform, wrapped in a threadbare coat too thin for the morning chill. Her hair, streaked with gray now, was pulled back in a loose knot, and her face, always a little more serious than mine, was pinched with sorrow and exhaustion. But when she saw me, her mouth broke into something between a sob and a smile, and she hurried forward. I dropped my suitcase and met her halfway. We collided into each other, arms wrapping tight, the years and miles and mistakes collapsing between us like ash. She smelled of soap and home and the faint sweetness of boiled cassava, and in that moment, I didn't care about anything else. I buried my face in her shoulder, the way I had when we were girls hiding from thunderstorms under our mother's quilt. We didn't speak right away. We just held on, as if letting go would undo the fragile thread that had finally pulled us back together. When we did start walking, it was slow, arm in arm, past houses with peeling paint and sagging porches, past the little market where old men sat playing cards on milk crates, past faces that peeked through curtains and doorways, recognizing me even after all these years. An old man sitting on his porch lifted his hand in greeting, 2 fingers to his forehead. A little boy on a rusted bicycle skidded to a stop and waved shyly. Here, I was not invisible. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The white paint had faded to a tired gray, and the porch steps creaked alarmingly under our weight. But it stood firm, stubborn against time and weather, just like my father had. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sage, boiled coffee, and something frying in the kitchen. The rooms were filled with low, murmured voices, the shuffle of chairs being moved, the quiet sound of someone clearing their throat to hold back tears. Flowers were everywhere, cheap, bright arrangements crammed into every available vase and mason jar, their colors too cheerful against the somber walls. The first thing I noticed was the absence. The empty chair by the fireplace, the battered boots still sitting neatly by the door, the walking stick my father had carved by hand, leaning against the wall as if waiting for him to return and claim it. The second thing I noticed was how full the house was despite the hollow it carried. Family, neighbors, friends, people who had known my father not as a footnote, not as a servant, but as a man. A good man. They came bearing food, shoulders to cry on, and the kind of unspoken understanding that didn't need to be translated into words. Lucy led me upstairs to the small room we had once shared as girls. It hadn't changed much. The same worn quilt on the bed, the same crooked photograph of our parents laughing in the backyard, caught mid-spin during a summer barbecue years before Mama had passed. I set my suitcase down and sat heavily on the edge of the bed, letting the grief settle into my bones. Later that evening, as the house quieted and visitors began to trickle out, I found myself sitting alone in my father's room. It smelled of him still. Sawdust, old books, something warm and earthy I couldn't quite name. His bed was neatly made, the coverlet stretched tight, as if he had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any second to smooth a hand over my hair and tell me everything would be all right. I pulled the photograph from my pocket, the one I had carried all these years, and placed it gently on his nightstand next to a faded Bible and a small tin of mints he kept for the church children. The funeral was scheduled for 2 days later. I spent those days helping where I could, peeling vegetables in the kitchen, ironing shirts, making coffee for visitors. It felt good to move, to have my hands busy, even while my heart staggered under the weight of everything I hadn't said, hadn't done. I watched Lucy quietly, the way her shoulders hunched a little more now, the way her laugh cracked like thin ice when someone told a story about Papa fixing a broken fence with nothing but twine and a pocket knife. I saw the grief wearing her down, threadbare, but I also saw her strength, fierce and undeniable, holding all of us together like mortar between bricks. The night before the funeral, the rain came. It started as a whisper against the roof, then built into a steady drumming that seemed to seep into the walls, the floorboards, the very air we breathed. I sat by the window in the bedroom, watching the water race down the glass, my arms wrapped around my knees. It felt fitting somehow, like even the sky understood what we had lost. Lucy came in after midnight, 2 mugs of strong, sweet coffee balanced carefully in her hands. She handed one to me and sat down without a word, her legs tucked up beneath her. "He loved the rain," she said finally, her voice rough with too many tears. "Said it made everything honest." I smiled through the tightness in my chest because I could hear him saying it, plain as day. Standing barefoot on the porch, arms spread wide to the storm, laughing like he owned the sky. "I should have been here," I whispered, the guilt sharp and fresh. "You are here," Lucy said simply. "That's what matters." I sipped the coffee, letting the bitterness ground me, the sweetness remind me that life was still here, stubborn and waiting. Downstairs, someone stirred. Probably one of the cousins setting up more chairs for the service tomorrow. The smell of strong coffee and damp earth filled the house, weaving into the memory of family and laughter, and the crackle of the old radio Papa used to leave on in the kitchen, even after the news ended. When I finally crawled into bed, the rain still falling steady and sure, I pressed my forehead to the pillow and let myself cry. Not the silent, hidden tears of the Dalton house, but raw, racking sobs that shook my whole body. Grief, sharp and unapologetic, spilling out of the cracks I had spent too many years trying to mortar shut. And through it all, somewhere deep inside, a small, stubborn voice, my father's voice, rose up through the sorrow, steady and clear. "You're worth more than they'll ever admit. Don't let them make you small." I clung to those words as I drifted off to sleep. The storm outside humming a lullaby in a language older than loss. Tomorrow, we would bury him. Tomorrow, we would say goodbye. But tonight, I grieved not just for him. I grieved for all the years I had spent silent. And I promised, as the rain wept against the windows, that silence would no longer define me. The morning of the funeral broke heavy and gray, the rain still clinging stubbornly to the earth, soaking into the cracked sidewalks and dripping from the sagging eaves of the church roof. The steeple, once proudly upright, now leaned slightly to the left, as if bowing in sorrow. The parking lot was already filling with old pickup trucks and battered sedans by the time Lucy and I arrived, arm in arm. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood, candle wax, and flowers. So many flowers they spilled from vases and crowded every available surface. A riot of white lilies, deep red roses, and sprays of yellow chrysanthemums. Their brightness felt almost defiant in the face of so much grief. The coffin sat at the front of the church, simple and polished, adorned only by a folded flag and a single worn photograph. Papa standing beside the old tractor he had rebuilt from scrap, his smile wide and unbothered, his hat tilted against the sun. I gripped Lucy's hand as we moved forward, our footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. When we reached the front pew, I paused, staring at the photograph, feeling the breath catch painfully in my chest. The eyes that looked back at me were exactly as I remembered, kind, stubborn, full of quiet mischief. It was almost enough to make me believe for one traitorous second that if I called out, he might laugh and turn toward me. But he didn't, and he wouldn't. Not anymore. The service began with an old hymn, the kind that wound its way through the rafters and wrapped around your ribs, making it impossible not to cry. The pastor spoke of my father's life, of his hands that built and fixed and comforted, of his belief that dignity wasn't bought with money, but earned with kindness and hard work. Lucy read a poem, her voice trembling only once before she pushed through. An old neighbor stood and told a story about how Papa had once fixed the town's power line with nothing but a ladder, a hammer, and a prayer. People laughed through their tears, and the sound was the purest thing I'd heard in years. When it was my turn to speak, my legs shook as I rose from the pew. I walked slowly to the pulpit, clutching a folded piece of paper in my hand, though I knew every word by heart. I stood there for a long moment, staring out at the faces, weathered, open, real. These were the people who had known me as a child, who had sent me off to the city with whispered prayers and small, hopeful smiles. "My father wasn't a rich man," I began, my voice soft but steady. He didn't own a fancy house. He didn't travel the world. He didn't care for titles or trophies, but he had a kind of wealth that most people never touch. He gave. He gave with his hands, with his time, with his heart. He showed up, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. I paused, breathing against the lump in my throat. I didn't get to say goodbye. I was too far away, caught up in a life that measured worth by silence and obedience. A life where I made myself small so others could feel large. And I let it happen. I let it happen for too long. Until I forgot what my father taught me, that my worth is not measured by how well I serve other people's comfort, but by how fiercely I honor my own truth. My eyes blurred, but I forced myself to keep looking at that photograph, at the man who had never once asked me to be less. "I'm sorry, Papa," I whispered. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. But I'm here now, and I promise I'll never be invisible again." The silence that followed was deep, reverent. No coughs, no shuffling of feet, just the heavy, sacred weight of shared grief and love. When I stepped down, Lucy reached out and squeezed my hand, her own tears shining. After the final hymn, we moved in a slow, solemn procession to the cemetery behind the church. The rain, heavier now, soaked through our clothes and plastered hair to faces, but no one seemed to notice. We gathered around the open grave, umbrellas blooming like dark flowers against the gray sky. I stood beside Lucy, the old photograph clutched tight to my chest as the casket was lowered into the earth. The sound of the ropes groaning against the wood, the soft thud of wet soil hitting the lid, it felt like being hollowed out from the inside. I pressed the photograph against my heart and whispered, "I'm sorry. I should have been here. I should have held your hand." Arms wrapped around me then, Lucy's, then cousins, neighbors, layer upon layer of warmth and sorrow and understanding. Their presence didn't erase the guilt, but it dulled the edges, made it bearable. "He knew," Lucy murmured into my hair. "He always knew you loved him." The rain did not let up. It dripped into our shoes, ran down the backs of our necks, soaked our skin until we shivered. But no one moved. No one hurried. We stayed until the last shovelful of earth had been laid, until the grave was covered and the pastor murmured a final prayer that was almost lost to the sound of the rain. Later, after the service, the house filled again, this time with food and stories, hugs and tentative laughter, the living trying to stitch light back into the fabric of the world. I sat on the porch, my legs curled beneath me, watching the rain drizzle past the sagging roofline. My dress was damp, my feet muddy, but for the first time in years, I felt rooted to something real. Behind me, the house buzzed with voices, children darting between legs, old friends clinking glasses, someone tuning a battered guitar in the corner. It was messy and imperfect and loud, and it was home. As I sat there watching the sky turn from gray to a soft bruised pink, Noah appeared, notebook tucked under his arm. He sat down beside me without a word, offering me a paper towel to dry my hands. I accepted it, smiling faintly. "You said something at the church," he said, voice low, "about being made small." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "I've been writing stories," he continued, tapping his notebook. "Little ones, honest ones. About people around here, I think." He hesitated, his bright eyes searching my face. "I think you should tell yours." I looked down at my hands, roughened and calloused from 1,000 unnoticed labors. The idea of speaking, really speaking about everything that had happened terrified me. It felt like standing naked in a storm. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, a small, fierce ember that refused to die. I didn't answer Noah right away. But I didn't say no. That night, after the last dish was washed and the last hug exchanged, I sat at my father's old desk, the battered photograph standing watch beside me. I picked up a pen, stared at the blank page, and let the words come. Not perfect, not polished, but true. I wrote about the silence. I wrote about the coldness. I wrote about the years spent being unseen, unheard, unnoticed. And I wrote about the moment I chose to leave. I wrote the promise I had made at my father's grave, that I would never again let anyone decide my worth. It was the first time in years I had told the truth, and it wasn't the last. I didn't expect much to come from that letter. In truth, I wrote it more for myself than anyone else, a way to peel off the layers of silence I had worn for too long, a way to lay my story bare, even if no one else ever read it. But Noah had other ideas. 2 days after the funeral, He asked if he could edit it lightly, just to clean up the grammar and make the sentences flow. I agreed, thinking it was a small kindness, a gesture between a grieving nephew and an aunt who had lost too much. I didn't ask what he intended to do with it, because honestly, I didn't think I had the strength to care. I found out the next morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table with Lucy, sipping lukewarm coffee and picking at a plate of fried plantains, when Noah came barreling through the screen door, his eyes wide and breathless. "You need to see this," he said, waving his phone like a flag. Lucy and I exchanged a glance before she leaned forward to squint at the tiny screen. There, bold as daylight, was the title, "The Maid's Letter." Published on a small but respected community blog that focused on labor rights and personal stories from the unheard corners of America. I blinked at it, stunned. "You posted it," I whispered, my mouth suddenly dry. Noah nodded, his smile sheepish but unrepentant. "No names, no cities, just your truth, just the story." Before I could fully process what that meant, Lucy's phone began buzzing against the table. Then Noah's. Then the old landline mounted on the wall. Messages flooded in, some from neighbors, some from strangers, some from local journalists wanting to know more. The piece had caught fire, spreading faster than anyone expected, fueled by people who had lived some version of my life and recognized themselves in every aching line. Within hours, it was picked up by a regional radio station. By the next day, it had been shared thousands of times across social media. Women, mostly, maids, housekeepers, nannies, caretakers, wrote messages filled with tears and gratitude. I thought I was the only one. I never told anyone what they did to me until now. "Thank you for giving us a voice." Each message hit me like a stone and built something inside me I hadn't felt in years. A bridge back to the world, back to myself. I stayed hidden at first, curled up in my father's old armchair in the living room, the weight of what was happening almost too big to comprehend. Outside, life moved as it always had, children laughing in the yard, neighbors calling greetings across porches. But inside me, something monumental had shifted. Then came the whispers. Someone had recognized the details buried in the letter. A former housekeeper from the Dalton estate, someone long gone and long forgotten, confirmed what many readers had already suspected. Quietly, then loudly, the story shifted from being about one woman's experience to being about a powerful family, their history of mistreatment, and the ugly truths hidden behind their polished gates. It didn't take long for the media to catch on. An investigative piece ran in the Sunday paper, anonymous sources, financial records, even a few blurred photographs of Mrs. Dalton stepping into a black SUV, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, her mouth tight with anger. News anchors debated the ethics of domestic labor in America. Talk shows hosted panels about systemic exploitation, about dignity and silence and the price of obedience. The Dalton name became a cautionary tale. Their charity gala was quietly canceled. Endorsements and speaking invitations disappeared like smoke. Reporters camped outside their estate gates, drones circling the property like vultures. Lawsuits, whispered at first, then filed openly by former employees emboldened by my letter, began stacking up. I didn't watch it unfold with glee. I didn't gloat. I watched with a kind of detached sorrow, the way you might watch a fire gut a house you once knew, a house that had never been a home. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad for them. They had built their world on other people's backs. They had never imagined the people might stand up. One night, as Lucy and I sat on the porch watching the fireflies blink in the humid air, she turned to me and asked, "Do you regret it?" I thought about it for a long time, listening to the cicadas hum and the distant bark of a dog. "No," I said finally, my voice soft but certain. "Not even a little. Because the truth, once spoken, doesn't fit back into the bottle. It stretches and grows and echoes, and once people hear it, really hear it, they can never unhear it." That same night, Noah brought me a flyer he had picked up from the local shelter for women and children. They were looking for someone to help intake new arrivals, someone who understood what it meant to be unseen, to feel powerless. "You could make a difference," he said, his voice shy but full of hope. "You already are." The idea terrified me. I wasn't sure I was strong enough. I wasn't sure I deserved to be the person others turned to for help. But the next morning, I tucked the flyer into my pocket and walked to the shelter. It was a modest building, tucked behind the health clinic, with peeling paint and a crooked sign, but it hummed with a kind of fierce, stubborn life that I recognized immediately. The director, Angela, interviewed me over tea. She didn't ask about the letter. She didn't ask about the Daltons. She asked if I could show up every day, if I could listen, if I could remember what it felt like to be invisible. I told her yes. I started the following Monday. The work wasn't easy. Women arrived broken and scared, sometimes with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the children clinging to their legs. Some didn't speak at all for days. Some refused eye contact. Some curled into themselves so tightly it seemed a miracle they could still stand. I didn't try to fix them. I sat with them. I listened. I folded blankets, made tea, handed out clean clothes, offered smiles without asking for them in return. Slowly they began to trust me, because they could see it in the way I moved, in the way I sat without filling the silence, in the way I knew when to offer a hand and when to simply wait. I wasn't their savior. I was their mirror. Proof that survival was possible. Each day, each woman, each whispered thank you stitched a little more strength into the fabric of my life. I wasn't just healing myself anymore. I was building something bigger, something lasting. I was no longer Maria James, the maid behind the marble walls. I was Maria James, the woman who walked away, the woman who spoke up, the woman who helped others find their voice too. And somewhere out there, beyond the headlines and the lawsuits, beyond the polished gates and the hollow laughter, I knew the Daltons must have heard the echo of my leaving. I hoped they did, because silence, once broken, doesn't just disappear. It spreads, it grows, it changes everything. The weeks turned into months, and life unfolded, not with grand sweeping changes, but in small, steady ways that felt more real than anything I had ever known behind the marble walls of the Dalton estate. Each morning, I woke in a modest room above the shelter, sunlight filtering through the curtains, the scent of coffee drifting up from the kitchen downstairs. No bells, no schedules snapped onto clipboards, just the simple rhythm of breathing, living, belonging. I spent my days meeting new women, each carrying their own invisible scars. Some came with children, their arms full and their faces hollowed out by exhaustion. Some came alone, clutching bags packed in panic and desperation. I greeted each one the same way, with open hands, with the understanding that survival wasn't always loud or brave. Sometimes, survival was just walking through the door. In the evenings, after the shelter grew quiet, I would sit on the back porch with a worn notebook balanced on my lap, jotting down pieces of the day, the moments when someone laughed for the first time in weeks, the look in a child's eyes when they realized they were safe. These little stories weren't for publication. They were just for me. Proof that healing wasn't just possible, it was already happening. It was on one of those quiet evenings that Angela, the shelter director, handed me an envelope with a curious smile. "You got something," she said, placing it carefully on the table. I wiped my hands on my jeans and picked it up. It was heavy cream stock, edged in gold, the handwriting formal and elegant. My heart skipped as I opened it. The National Domestic Workers Alliance was hosting their annual conference in the capital. Advocates, policymakers, and workers from across the country would be there. They wanted me to speak. Not as an anonymous letter writer, not as a nameless maid hidden in someone else's shadow, but as Maria James. In my own voice. For days, I left the invitation sitting untouched on my nightstand, unsure whether I was ready to step back into the light. Fame was never what I had wanted. I didn't care for the spotlight or applause. I didn't want pity. But every intake interview, every trembling voice I listened to at the shelter reminded me why I had started speaking at all. I didn't break my silence to become a symbol. I did it so that women who had been invisible could be seen. So finally, one morning, I picked up a pen, signed my acceptance, and sent it back. The train ride to the Capitol was different this time. No fear coiled in my gut. No silent prayers whispered into my sleeves. I sat by the window, dressed simply in a soft gray dress Lucy had helped me press the night before, and watched the fields and towns blur past. I didn't feel like I was running away or chasing something that would never be mine. I felt still, steady, rooted. The city loomed ahead, tall glass buildings gleaming under the weight of a restless sky. Crowds bustled down the sidewalks, heads bowed against the autumn wind. Taxi horns blared in the distance, and for the first time, I didn't feel small here. I moved through it with quiet purpose, my suitcase rattling behind me, my heart wide open. At the conference center, banners hung from the balconies, bold letters rippling in the breeze. Dignity, voice, justice. I pressed a hand against my chest for a moment, grounding myself. I belonged here. Not because anyone had given me permission, but because I had earned it. Backstage, a young assistant led me to a waiting area. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed me a glass of water. "We're honored you're here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I smiled at her, not with pride, but with recognition. I saw myself in her. A woman who still carried more fear than she should, a woman learning she deserved to take up space. I listened as the speaker before me talked about wage theft, about the millions of invisible workers whose lives made other people's comfort possible. And when they called my name, I rose, my legs steady, my hands sure. The room hushed as I crossed the stage, the weight of hundreds of eyes settling over me not like a burden but like a blessing. I stood at the podium, adjusted the microphone, and began. "I was a maid for 12 years, I said. My voice was clear, unhurried, in a house where my name was rarely spoken, where my grief was an inconvenience, where my existence was invisible until it interfered with someone else's plans." The silence deepened, not out of discomfort but respect. I stayed, I continued, because I believed for a long time that if I worked hard enough, if I kept my head down, I would earn dignity, respect, safety. But the truth is, silence doesn't protect us, it cages us. I paused, letting the words settle. And when I lost my father, and they told me that shining their floors was more important than saying goodbye, I realized that they would never see me unless I forced them to. I spoke of the night I walked away, suitcase in hand, heart cracked open, but determined. I spoke of the funeral in the rain, of the letter I had written not to tear anyone down, but to reclaim my own voice. I spoke of the shelter, of the women who found the courage to start again, of the quiet revolution happening in kitchens and laundry rooms and back porches all across the country. I ended simply, I am not invisible anymore. The room rose in silence, the sound of chairs scraping softly against the floor, hundreds of people standing not because they were told to, but because something inside them recognized the truth of it, the cost of silence and the power of breaking it. Afterward, people lined up not to congratulate me, but to thank me. Some hugged me with tears shining in their eyes. Some just squeezed my hand and whispered, "Me too." I left the conference center without fanfare, slipping into the soft gray evening, like a woman walking into the next chapter of her life. Back at the shelter, life resumed its steady beat. I filed papers, I served tea, I listened. But now, when the women arrived with fear in their eyes and shoulders drawn tight, they looked at me differently. Not with awe, but with recognition. Because I wasn't just a worker. I was proof. Proof that you could survive betrayal. Proof that you could reclaim your voice. Proof that dignity wasn't something given to you by those with power. It was something you carried inside you all along. One Sunday afternoon, long after the first frost had dusted the windows and the nights grew long, I found myself standing again at my father's grave. The grass around the headstone was sparse and brittle under my boots. The wind tugged at the edges of my coat. I knelt, brushing a few dead leaves away from the stone, and smiled. "I did it, Papa," I said softly. I kept my promise. I sat there for a while, telling him about the women at the shelter, about the laughter in the halls, about the letters and the speeches, and the way life had stubbornly, wonderfully gone on. And when the sun began to sink low behind the trees, painting the world in amber light, I rose, brushing the dirt from my knees. I didn't feel hollow anymore. I didn't feel invisible. I felt whole. And as I walked back toward the shelter, where children laughed and women found their strength again, I realized something simple and beautiful. My story hadn't ended when I walked away from the Dalton estate. It had just begun. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of Maria's journey. If this story touched your heart, it's because it reminds us of something we all know deep down, that dignity isn't something anyone can give or take away. It's something we carry within us, even when the world tries to make us forget. Maria's story shows that it's never too late to stand up, to reclaim your voice, and to choose the life you deserve. Life may push us into silence sometimes, but every one of us has the power to step out of the shadows and into the light. You are never too small to matter. You are never too late to be seen. I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Please share it in the comments. It means so much to hear from you. And if this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every week, we bring you powerful, inspiring stories just like this. Stories that remind us of the strength we sometimes forget we have. Thank you again for being here. Until next time, take care of yourself and never let anyone make you small.